When humiliation became my turning point, a father's story who didn't give up. I never imagined that one day my birthday would turn into the worst moment of my life, but also the turning point I needed. My name is Fernando. I'm 49 years old, and I went through something I never thought I'd endure with dignity. It all started when my wife, Patricia, decided to throw a surprise party at home. I knew there were problems in the marriage, but I had no idea how big a blow I was about to receive. When I arrived, the living room was full of her family, all with fake smiles and confetti in their hands. Before I could even greet anyone, Patricia handed me an envelope, and inside were the divorce papers. I felt my stomach turn, my head spin, and a wave of shame and despair washed over me. It's strange to describe what it feels like when everything around you seems to laugh at your pain, but it was exactly like that. Total humiliation, and the feeling of being attacked in a cold and calculated way. I spent seconds frozen, unable to react, while I watched her parents, Paulo and Vanessa, laughing and celebrating the situation as if it were a great victory. Deep down, a silent anger began to simmer, mixed with the sadness of realizing that a person you had shared years of your life with could suddenly become so cruel. Even with the pain, something inside me wouldn't let me break. I had already realized Patricia's betrayal months earlier, but I needed to act with clarity, not impulsively. I remember thinking, as the confetti still fell around me, that this party wouldn't be the end of my story. I needed to react, but strategically. Emotions were running high: anger, fear, shame, a profound exhaustion of carrying alone a relationship that had become toxic. Amidst the despair, a strange clarity began to form. This wasn't just about me, but also about my children, Enzo and Valentina. I needed to protect them, to ensure that the manipulation of Patricia and her family had no place in the life we had built together. It was at that moment that I realized that all the public humiliation could become the fuel for my own liberation. The fear was still there, a weight in my throat and soul, but there was a new strength, an instinct for emotional survival and justice that was beginning to manifest itself intensely and almost uncontrollably. When I decided to fight back, it wasn't out of revenge. It was out of clarity, out of a need to set boundaries and show that I wouldn't be stepped on or manipulated. I took the envelope Patricia had given me and began mentally organizing the evidence I'd gathered over the months. Messages, meeting records, indisputable evidence of her infidelity with Juliana's ex-boyfriend, her own sister. Feeling those pieces of truth in my hands gave me a paradoxical sense of power and vulnerability at the same time. I felt vulnerable because I was exposing my private life, my failed marriage, but also powerful because I had control over what would be revealed. There was no blind rage, there was strategy and, above all, an intention to protect my children and end an abusive relationship once and for all. Adrenaline mixed with a racing heart and a sense of imminent justice, which I needed to transform into concrete action before despair took over. The moment of revealing the truth was terrifying. Patricia and her family had no idea what I knew, and the shock in her eyes when I began to speak was indescribable. Paulo and Vanessa's proud laughter disappeared in seconds, replaced by confusion and an almost palpable tension in the air. Every word I said, every piece of evidence I showed wasn't just an attack. It was an act of liberation, of exposing a reality they'd tried to hide. I felt every muscle in my body tense, every heartbeat charged with intense emotion. But at the same time, there was a strange calm, a certainty that I was doing what I needed to do. The silence that followed was crushing, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt I had regained control over my life. It wasn't just about the divorce. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about my right not to be manipulated and disrespected, and about teaching my children that certain attitudes should not be tolerated. The real turning point came when I revealed that the house, which had meant so much to Patricia and her family, was no longer in my name. It had been transferred directly to my children, Enzo and Valentina. The shock and shame on the faces of everyone present was indescribable. For the first time, I felt the weight of humiliation lift into strength. I was no longer vulnerable. I was in control, protected by the most important bonds in my life. The initial anger transformed into a profound clarity. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone except myself and my children. The feeling of liberation was almost physical, a deep breath after years of suffocating. That day, I realized that overcoming is not something that happens gradually, but sometimes manifests in a moment, a decision, an act that changes everything at once. I still carried pain, but the hope and sense of empowerment became stronger than any shame they could impose on me. After that day, I realized it wasn't just the humiliation I'd overcome, but the way I saw myself and my life. I felt a mixture of extreme exhaustion and unprecedented clarity. Everything I'd been through had brought me to this point, to the point where I was able to turn the situation around. At first, the fear of facing Patricia and her family was almost paralyzing, and I still felt ashamed of having lived in such a toxic marriage. But with each piece of evidence I presented and each reaction I observed, the feeling of strength grew. I understood that I didn't need to humiliate myself or beg for respect, because true respect is earned by setting boundaries and not allowing yourself to be manipulated. Looking at Enzo and Valentina, I felt an immense responsibility. They needed to see that their parents can face problems head-on, even when everything seems against you. It was at that moment that I realized my overcoming wasn't just personal, but also a life lesson for them, showing them that courage comes from acting with clarity, not impulse. The feeling of relief mixed with anger continued to overwhelm me. It was strange to feel pride and pain at the same time, but each emotion had its place. For years, I had been emotionally manipulated, believing the betrayal and humiliation were my fault. Seeing Patricia and her family shocked by my actions gave me a kind of catharsis. I was finally recognizing my worth without needing external validation. I remembered all the nights I cried alone, trying to understand where I had failed, and suddenly everything made sense. It wasn't my fault, it was their choice to act disrespectfully. This clarity gave me the strength to move forward, even knowing that the coming months would be complicated. With legal battles and emotional confrontations, I was not only standing up for my rights, I was also defining my future and the future of my children based on justice and respect. What surprised me most was realizing that resilience doesn't come from the control you exert over others, but from the strength you maintain within yourself. Facing that situation, I felt every part of my life reorganize. Old fears lost their grip, and the determination to rebuild my life in a healthy way gained ground. Even amidst the anger, public shame, and the pain of realizing that the person you loved deeply was capable of betrayal, something new emerged: clarity about what truly matters. I realized that relationships cannot be maintained at the expense of dignity, and that I needed to protect myself, prioritize my children, and reclaim my self-worth. For the first time in years, I no longer felt the need to hide my sadness or fear. I accepted that it was all part of the process of overcoming. After that episode, I also began to realize how small, everyday things became symbols of freedom. The first time I returned home alone, without fear or tension, I felt a strange, almost painful peace, as if I were breathing for the first time in years. Every simple gesture, like opening the door without anxiety or preparing dinner without stress, carried enormous weight. It was proof that I could still feel safe in my own home, without needing to be manipulated or humiliated. This feeling helped me regain my self-confidence, something I had lost amid the betrayals and manipulations. I still felt pain, but it no longer dominated me. Now there was room for reconstruction, even if gradual. Ultimately, that day taught me that facing pain head-on is the only way to overcome it. Nothing replaces confrontation, neither escape nor denial. Every tear, every suppressed scream, every moment of despair became fuel for my own liberation. Today, when I look back, I realize it wasn't just about divorce or betrayal. It was about learning to value myself, protecting my children, and finding strength amidst the pain. I feel more whole, clearer, and though I still carry scars, they don't define me. They define my resilience, my ability to react and rebuild. It was painful, but today I know that all of that brought me to the strongest version of myself. After that day, I began to realize that the initial feeling of humiliation had transformed into something different, a silent force that accompanied me with every decision. I still felt anger, yes, but it was no longer that desperate, paralyzing rage. It was an anger that drove me to protect my children, to not allow anyone to manipulate or harm us anymore. Enzo and Valentina began to notice a change in me as well. My actions, even simple ones, showed that I would no longer give in to disrespect. Everyday things, like helping them with their homework or cooking dinner together, began to carry a different emotional weight, as if each small gesture were a reaffirmation that I could rebuild our lives safely and with dignity. This realization gave me hope and made me realize that despite the pain, there was a path forward. One of the most difficult moments was dealing with external judgment. Friends, family, and acquaintances who learned about the party and the situation began to offer quick and often cruel opinions. At first, I felt like hiding, escaping everyone's gaze, but I realized that overcoming pain doesn't come from hiding. I accepted that my life had become public at that moment, and I used it to my advantage. I showed everyone through consistent actions that I was strong, and that manipulation, humiliation, and betrayal would not define who I am. This required enormous strength because the fear of what others would think was still present, but the need to maintain my dignity and protect my children overcame that fear. Each look of surprise or awkward silence was a small victory, a reaffirmation that I was on the right path. The process of dealing with Patricia legally also tested me in ways I hadn't expected. There was the divorce battle, the details of property division, and the constant emotional strain of dealing with her and her family. At times, the exhaustion was overwhelming. I felt like giving up, simply running away from it all. But I always remembered my children and what was at stake. I needed to show them that unfair situations can be faced with dignity and clarity. It was a painful but transformative learning experience. I learned that my strength doesn't depend on the absence of fear, but on the ability to keep going, even when it's present. Every step I took during that period strengthened my resilience and helped me realize that I wasn't alone. Enzo and Valentina were my silent support and constant motivation. Something that helped me a lot was writing about everything I was feeling. Recording my experience allowed me to organize my thoughts, separate anger from clarity, and see solutions amidst the chaos. I discovered that expressing my pain honestly didn't make me weak. On the contrary, it made me stronger. Each written line, each word expressed, was a small step toward my emotional freedom. I felt like I was lifting a weight from within, allowing reason and resilience room to grow. It was a powerful discovery. I realized that strength lies not only in external actions, but also in how we process and deal with our emotions, even when they are raw and intense. Looking back today, I see that that day was more than a public humiliation. It was the moment that awakened me to my own strength. I realized that pain can be a catalyst for profound change if you're willing to face it head on. I still feel lingering fear and sadness when I think about what happened, but they no longer paralyze me. My life is being rebuilt with clarity, focusing on my children and what truly matters. I discovered that overcoming doesn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to transform each painful experience into something that strengthens, teaches, and guides us toward a more dignified and secure future. One of the hardest things after all this was dealing with the silence. Patricia's absence from our lives and the way her family reacted created a strange, heavy space that forced me to confront my own feelings without distractions. At first, I was afraid to face that emptiness, to realize how much I had been used and manipulated. But gradually I realized that silence was also liberating. It allowed me to think clearly, organize my plans, and strengthen my bond with Enzo and Valentina. Every moment of calm, even if fraught with painful memories, became an exercise in resilience, learning to breathe, reflect, and act with emotional security. I discovered that overcoming grief doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet but firm, growing from the inside out, strengthening every decision and every step I take. Another enormous challenge was dealing with the shame I felt, even though I knew it wasn't my fault. Patricia's family's laughter and comments echoed in my mind for days. I felt like shrinking, disappearing, but I realized this shame was a reflection of their behavior, not mine. Little by little, I learned to look in the mirror and recognize that everything I've experienced doesn't diminish me. On the contrary, it strengthens me. With each step I took to rebuild my life, I felt my confidence return, a sense of dignity that didn't depend on anyone's approval. I discovered that overcoming grief isn't about erasing the pain, but rather about learning to walk through it, maintaining self-respect above all else. There were also times when I thought my children would pay the price for their mother's and her family's actions, but I quickly realized that how I reacted would be the most important example they could have. I needed to show them that manipulation or humiliation should not be tolerated, and that even in extreme situations, it is possible to act with clarity and dignity. Every action I took, every legal and emotional decision was aimed at making Enzo and Valentina understand that they have a right to safety, honesty, and respect. Feeling their gaze, the silent trust they placed in me, gave me strength I didn't even know existed. It was a feeling of mutual protection, a bond that strengthened like never before. There were days when the anger still lingered, reminding me of all the betrayals, humiliations, and lies. At times I wanted to scream, cry, even feel physically angry, but I learned that control doesn't mean stifling feelings. It means understanding each emotion and deciding how to react. I used every bit of anger as fuel, transforming it into concrete actions to rebuild my life and protect my children. I learned that overcoming obstacles isn't linear. There are ups and downs, days of fear and sadness, but the most important thing is not to give up on yourself. The feeling of inner power that grew with each right decision showed me I was on the right path. Finally, I understood that that day that seemed like the end of the world was actually the beginning of something new. The public humiliation, the betrayal, the pain. Everything was transformed into learning, clarity, and strength. Today, I feel that every scar I carry is a symbol of resistance and resilience. I still feel sadness and anger, but they no longer dominate me. Most importantly, I discovered that I can face any situation, protect my children, and rebuild my life with dignity. And it is this sense of freedom, strength, and hope that keeps me going day after day, proving that even in the midst of pain, it is possible to bounce back and become stronger than ever. After everything, I realized that overcoming grief isn't about forgetting what happened, but about learning to live with the pain and transform it into strength. I still remember the humiliation, anger, and fear I felt that day, but today they don't define me. What defines me is the clarity I gained about my limits, about what's acceptable, and about how to protect those I love. Every decision I made, every step I took to rebuild my life, showed me that dignity doesn't depend on others recognizing it, but on maintaining strength and self-esteem, even when everything seems to be against you. It was painful, yes, but necessary. One of the most valuable things I learned was that we don't have to face everything alone. My children, Enzo and Valentina, were my motivation and silent support. Feeling their trust in me, even in the most tense moments, gave me the strength to keep going, to not let myself be overcome by the weight of humiliation or the manipulations of Patricia and her family. I understood that overcoming is also a collective process, that those we love and care for can help us transform pain into learning and growth. This deep connection became my refuge and my daily fuel. Today, I can look at Patricia and the entire situation with a clarity that once seemed impossible. I no longer feel blind rage or paralyzing fear. I feel only a mixture of relief and determination. Relief in knowing I did the right thing, that I didn't give in to manipulation, and determination to continue rebuilding my life with my children. Every challenge I faced, every moment of humiliation turned into strength, taught me that life can be fair, but not without effort and courage. You have to be ready to react, even when all seems lost. The most important lesson I take away is that no matter how desperate the situation, there is always a way out if we maintain clarity and inner strength. I still bear scars, but they are not open wounds. They are reminders of resistance, courage, and overcoming. Every time I look at my children and see the security in their eyes, I remember that it was worth the fight, that every tear and every moment of fear was transformed into learning and growth. Today, I feel stronger than I have ever felt before, and I know I can face any adversity with dignity and resilience. If I could leave a message for anyone going through something similar, it would be this: the pain is intense, the shame is real, but the strength to rise again is within you. Don't let yourself be defined by the humiliations or betrayals of others. Protect those you love, maintain clarity, and make conscious choices. Overcoming comes from confrontation, not escape. I lived through that day that seemed like the end of the world and turned it into the beginning of my freedom. I'm proud of who I've become and the life I'm rebuilding with my children, even though I know there are still challenges. Life goes on, and mine now is one of dignity, courage, and hope.